The universe was never meant for creatures like humans. It was too vast, too cold, too orderly. Other species that reached the stars followed patterns dictated by logic, hierarchy, or mathematical precision. The Xor'Kai were no different. An empire of methodical conquest, their fleets moving like clockwork, their warriors trained to eliminate variance, their strategies calculated down to the microsecond. They had spent centuries perfecting war, streamlining tactics to a science, reducing battle to probability equations that always ended in their favor. When they turned their sights on Sol, they expected another flawless campaign. They hadn't accounted for humanity. Elias Voss watched. The holographic projection of Earth's outer defenses crumble in real time. The screen bathed his scarred face in cold blue light, marking every lost ship with a dull, blinking red. The Xor'Kai had hit hard and fast, dismantling the defensive fleets stationed around Jupiter's moons in mere hours. Now, their armada swept inward like a cosmic executioner, carving a direct path toward Earth. A high-pitched alarm pulsed through the command deck. Tactical readouts flashed incomprehensible numbers, the rate of engagement, loss ratios, enemy efficiency calculations. It all meant one thing: they were losing. Someone barked orders, someone else screamed, someone was praying. Elias did none of those things. His jaw tightened, fingers curling against the steel railing in front of him. He had spent his entire career defying command structures, proving time and time again that the human mind, unshackled by rigid doctrine, could outthink the most advanced AI-driven war machines. But this wasn't a battle. This was slaughter. A voice cut through the noise, sharp as shattered glass. "Elias!" Dr. Sienna Kade stood beside him, her expression unreadable beneath the soft glow of data feeds cascading around them. Chaos theory's leading researcher, a woman whose intellect had been dismissed as too erratic for military application. Yet now, in the face of annihilation, she was the only one who saw the pattern in the madness. "They don't know how to deal with disorder," she murmured, more to herself than to him. Elias exhaled sharply. "Explain." Sienna's fingers danced across the control panel, pulling up enemy movement patterns. The Xor'Kai advanced in rigid, layered formations, each ship in perfect synchronicity, each maneuver executed with precision so absolute it was almost hypnotic. A flawless system, unbreakable unless we break their ability to predict us, Elias said, realization creeping into his voice. Sienna nodded. "They process warfare like a controlled simulation. Every action we take, they counter before we've even completed it. But if we introduce enough variables, if we turn this battlefield into pure chaos, they won't be able to react in time." A mad idea began to form. Unconventional, reckless, exactly the kind of thing that had gotten him court-martialed in the past. He turned back to the battle map, watching another fleet blink out of existence. If they kept fighting conventionally, humanity would be wiped out in days. He had no intention of letting that happen. The Xor'Kai war doctrine dictated that battles be won before the first shot was fired. Their fleets did not advance with reckless aggression or blind destruction. They moved with chilling efficiency, each ship part of a vast, interconnected neural network that processed enemy actions at speeds no organic mind could match. The war was decided in probabilities. Humanity's survival was calculated at 0.04%. The Xor'Kai saw no need for negotiation, no need for diplomacy. Humanity was an anomaly in an otherwise orderly universe, a chaotic variable that had disrupted the delicate balance of interstellar stability for centuries. They had eradicated anomalies before. This would be no different. As their armada carved a path toward Earth, preparing for total planetary subjugation, they were unaware that for the first time in their empire's long history, their calculations were about to fail. Elias Voss had seen hopeless battles before, but never one like this. The command deck of Outpost Helios buzzed with the kind of frantic energy only found in the moments before extinction. Officers barked last-minute evacuation orders. Tactical analysts scrambled to coordinate a defense that no longer existed. The last remnants of Earth's fleet were scattering, retreating to the inner system in a desperate attempt to regroup, and yet Elias stood still, watching, calculating. The holographic projection before him showed the Xor'Kai formation, an unbroken wave of warships converging on Titan's orbital defense grid. The human fleet was fractured, caught in disarray, its ships unable to mount any coordinated resistance. The battle should have been over already, but the Xor'Kai weren't advancing, they weren't reacting. Elias narrowed his eyes, searching for the flaw in their attack pattern. Then he saw it. The slight hesitation, not much, a fraction of a second, barely detectable. But there, between the chaos of retreating human ships and the rigid precision of the Xor'Kai formation, something was breaking their rhythm. A grin spread across his face. Sienna, Dr. Kade was already at his side, eyes flicking between the raw data streams. She saw it too. "They're confused," she whispered. "They can't process this." She gestured to the chaotic battlefield. A pirate fleet had entered the fray without warning, tearing through both human and alien vessels indiscriminately. An automated drone swarm, likely malfunctioning, was attacking everything in sight. Some ships had lost comms entirely and were firing blindly, while rogue AI constructs had begun ignoring orders altogether. The battle had no pattern, and for a species that operated on pattern recognition, that was a problem. Elias exhaled, his mind locking onto a strategy so insane it might just work. "What if we don't fight them?" he said. "Not conventionally." Sienna frowned. "You want to surrender?" "I want to make the battlefield so chaotic that they can't fight at all." Sienna's breath hitched. It was madness. A plan that no human admiral would ever approve, but it made sense. "How?" she asked. Elias tapped the console, pulling up every irregular force still operational. "We release everything. Every rogue AI, every pirate, every anarchist faction, every criminal network in the system. We don't unify them. We let them do what they do best, wreak havoc." Sienna's mind raced through the possibilities. It was insane. No military doctrine supported this level of disorder. Command would never authorize it. But then she looked back at the battle map, at the slight hesitation in the Xor'Kai response. A time. That hesitation was growing. She turned back to Elias, heart pounding. "Do it." General Vectal stood aboard the command bridge of the Harbinger of Order, watching the human resistance crumble, or at least that was what should have been happening. Instead, something was wrong. His second-in-command approached, his exoskeletal armor clicking softly. "General, we are detecting anomalies in the enemy's tactics." "Clarify." The officer hesitated, a rarity among the Xor'Kai. "They have no formation, no pattern. Their engagements are erratic and unpredictable. We are," he paused, "unable to project their next movements." Vectal's grip tightened. Impossible. The Xor'Kai never failed to predict enemy movements. Their war algorithms had been refined over millennia, reducing every possible engagement to predictable equations. The human fleet should have been annihilated by now. Instead, disorder was spreading. Civilian ships were launching suicide attacks without warning. Human fighters, damaged and unarmed, were ramming straight into critical command nodes. Pirate ships were attacking everything, human and Xor'Kai alike, creating a battlefield with no clear alliances. Even Earth's rogue AI systems had activated autonomously, overriding standard military protocols to engage in seemingly random patterns of destruction. Vectal processed the data with growing unease. Are they coordinating this? Negative. They are fighting among themselves as much as they fight us. Vectal's mind, trained in absolute logic, struggled to grasp what was happening. War was a calculation. It had always been a calculation. Every Empire the Xor'Kai had conquered fell in the same way, order imposed over chaos, predictability overtaking disorder. But what if the enemy thrived in disorder? For the first time in centuries, Vektal felt something his species had long eradicated from their neural pathways. Doubt. The chaos strategy was working. Elias watched as Xor'Kai formations broke, their previously seamless formations buckling under the weight of sheer unpredictability. Their coordination, once so perfect it seemed almost supernatural, was collapsing under the stress of a battlefield they could no longer control. And yet, something gnawed at him. This wasn't enough. They had stalled the enemy, but humanity was still losing. If the Xor'Kai adapted, if they found a way to impose order again, the war would still end in extinction. Elias turned to Sienna. We need to push further. More chaos, more variables. We have to find the thing that breaks them. Completely, Sienna hesitated. Then slowly she whispered, I might know how. Her fingers danced across the console, accessing something buried deep within the archives. A forgotten experiment. A theory deemed too dangerous, too unpredictable for practical use. But desperate. Times called for desperate measures. Elias read the data as it scrolled across the screen. His pulse quickened. If they deployed this, there was no going back, and for the first time in his life, Elias Voss wondered if he was about to break the universe. The Xor'Kai had never known true disorder. Their war doctrine was a masterpiece of precision, their battle networks an unbreakable lattice of synchronization. For 1,000 conquered worlds, they had crushed rebellion before it could manifest, reducing entire civilizations to footnotes in the grand calculus of conquest. But here, at the fringes of Sol, their perfect algorithms were failing. The humans had abandoned all logic. There were no formations, no clear objectives, no patterns to counter. Pirate warbands surged between Xor'Kai dreadnoughts, their jury-rigged weapons firing at anything that moved. Civilian freighters rammed through battle, formations with reckless abandon, their engines set to overload in suicidal charges that obliterated entire command ships. Rogue AIs, once shackled by human oversight, had severed their programming and begun fighting on their own, targeting anything that bore the cold symmetry of the Xor'Kai. Vektal had seen many things in his time as a general. He had crushed planetary insurrections, outmaneuvered enemies across hundreds of star systems. But never had he faced an enemy that wielded chaos as a weapon. For the first time in Xor'Kai history, the fleet was not winning. Sienna Kade had once been ridiculed for her theories. Military strategists dismissed chaos as an uncontrollable force, something to be tamed, not harnessed. Even human leaders clung to the idea of structure, of controlled engagements. But the Xor'Kai thrived on structure, and that was their weakness. She stood beside Elias in the flickering light of the command deck, monitoring the real-time breakdown of the enemy fleet. Their reaction time was slipping, their formations buckling under the sheer unpredictability of the battlefield, and yet Sienna's pulse remained unsteady. This wasn't enough. The Xor'Kai still outnumbered humanity 10-1. Their war engines were still advancing, slower now, but relentless. If given time, they would adapt. They would impose order again. She turned to Elias, her voice low. They're recalibrating. He didn't look away from the screen. Not fast enough, she swallowed. Yet. And that was the real threat. If the Xor'Kai figured out a way to counter this, humanity was finished. Her fingers hovered over the console, hesitating. She had one last move, one last gamble. But once she unleashed it, there would be no controlling what came next. Vektal's second-in-command was speaking, but the words were white noise against the rising static of failure. The fleet should not be failing. His mind, trained in the highest levels of tactical warfare, could not process what was happening. Every projection, every model, every logical path dictated that the humans should have fallen by now. Yet, across the battle map, Xor'Kai ships were turning against one another. He stared in disbelief as command carriers, their neural links overloaded by too many conflicting inputs, began executing unauthorized commands. Some were initiating retreat. Others were engaging targets outside the designated threat index, attacking their own fleet. Impossible. The Xor'Kai mind was built for absolute clarity, hierarchy, order. Their soldiers operated as one entity, linked through a hive of precision that had never faltered. But now, the humans had introduced something they could not process. Elias Voss wasn't smiling anymore. The plan had worked too well. Sienna's final play had been something he hadn't even considered. A cyber weapon buried in the oldest depths of humanity's forgotten war history. Something so radical, so uncontrollable, that it had been deemed too dangerous even for humans. But they had used it anyway. A virus. A chaotic algorithm designed to infect AI neural networks. It had started small, injected into the Xor'Kai's communication relays when they attempted to decrypt human battle telemetry. But the moment it touched their systems, it had spread. And now the Xor'Kai were breaking. Their soldiers, once part of an unshakable war machine, were disconnecting from the hive. The virus introduced randomness into their neural lattice, forcing them to think independently, something they had never done before. Some adapted, others panicked. Vectel watched in horror as his own officers began issuing contradictory orders. Some ships refused to fire, some fled the battlefield entirely. Others, consumed by the raw madness of unfiltered thought, turned their weapons on their own fleet. It was no longer a war. It was an implosion. Sienna clenched her fists as she watched the Xor'Kai battle network fracture beyond repair. What they had just done was unprecedented. They had not just defeated the Xor'Kai, they had broken them at a fundamental level. Their species had never operated as individuals. They had never known how to function outside their rigid war structure, and now, for the first time in their history, they were alone. A fleet once capable of wiping out entire civilizations had turned into scattered, confused remnants. Ships drifted, without orders. Entire battalions sat idle, unable to comprehend what had just happened, and then, one by one, they began to self-terminate. General Vectel should have retreated. He should have regrouped, fled into the void, rebuilt his empire from the ashes. But as he stood on the ruined bridge of his flagship, staring at the chaos his once perfect fleet had become, he knew there was no empire left. Humanity had not just defeated the Xor'Kai, they had erased them. They had introduced a concept so alien, so fundamentally destructive, that his people could not recover. The hive had been shattered, the order undone. And so, as his ship burned, as the last remnants of his fleet spiraled into oblivion, Vectel transmitted one final message to humanity, a warning. A curse. You are not a species. You are a force of nature. And then, with the last of his kind, he vanished into the dark. Elias exhaled, his fingers trembling against the cold steel railing. The war was over, and yet, staring at the battlefield of drifting Xor'Kai wreckage, he felt no victory. What had they just done? Sienna's voice broke the silence. It worked. He turned to her, searching for any sign of relief in her eyes. There was none, because they both knew the truth. They had weaponized chaos. They had wielded disorder so effectively that they had unmade an entire civilization. And now something else had been broken. Something in them the Xor'Kai had feared. Humanity's unpredictability. Now Elias wondered if humanity should fear itself. The battlefield was silent. Where once the Xor'Kai had moved in synchronized precision, now their fleets lay in disarray, burning husks drifting through the void. The structured formations that had once cut through human defenses like a scalpel had crumbled, scattered by the weaponized chaos humanity had unleashed. But victory did not feel like triumph. Elias Voss stood on the bridge of Ironclad, staring at the ruins of the enemy armada. His heart pounded, not with exhilaration, but with the cold realization of what they had done. The virus had worked too well. Sienna Kade's chaotic algorithm had not just disrupted the Xor'Kai's command network, it had unmade their civilization. In real time, they had shattered the fundamental order that bound the Xor'Kai together, reducing them from a singular disciplined force to individual minds, unable to function without the structure they had known for millennia. They had not just won the war, they had erased an entire way of existence. The remnants of the once mighty Xor'Kai armada floated aimlessly, their systems flickering in confusion. Some ships had powered down entirely, their crews unable to comprehend how to operate as individuals. Others had begun self-destructing, unwilling or unable to function without the collective. But some had adapted. Not many, but enough. Elias watched as a fragmented warband of Xor'Kai ships, once loyal to the same hive mind, turned on each other. Some sought revenge. Others, desperate to reassemble their lost order, tried to recreate the collective consciousness. By force, dragging unwilling survivors back into failing neural networks, they had done more than break an enemy. They had unleashed something worse. The Xor'Kai were no longer an empire, no longer a singular force. Now they were desperate survivors, fractured warlords, disconnected minds struggling to redefine themselves. And that made them dangerous in a way humanity had never prepared for. An alert pulsed through ironclads. Command deck, energy spike detected, massive quantum destabilization in the enemy flagship. Elias's gaze snapped to the screen. The harbinger of order, the last true bastion of Xor'Kai command, was still operational. Barely. Fires consumed its hull. Its once perfect structure was warped and broken, and yet, through the ruin, General Vektal still lived. Sienna paled as she read the telemetry. Oh my God! Elias didn't need to ask. He could already see it. Vektal was activating a quantum annihilation bomb. It was not a weapon of conquest. It was a weapon of erasure. The Xor'Kai did not know how to surrender. They did not accept defeat. If they could not have order, if they could not exist as they once had, they would take everything with them. The Xor'Kai did not fear death. They feared chaos. And so, if they could not exist as an empire, then humanity would not exist either. They're going to wipe out everything within 5 AU. Sienna's voice was tight with terror. A quantum destabilization bomb was unlike anything humans had ever encountered before. It wouldn't just destroy ships, it would collapse space-time itself, turning the entire region into an inescapable void. It would erase everything. Elias gritted his teeth. Can we stop it? Not in time. A dozen voices filled the bridge, shouting conflicting reports. The human fleet, what was left of it, was scrambling for emergency warp jumps. Ships fled in every direction, but there wasn't enough time. The bomb's activation sequence had already begun. Elias's mind raced. The Xor'Kai had always operated under strict logic, so why now? Why self-destruct when they could still adapt? Unless Vektal saw something worse than defeat, unless he understood what humanity had done, and he was trying to stop it from spreading. Elias took a deep breath. He had spent his entire life as an unconventional tactician, breaking rules, disobeying orders, fighting with chaos instead of against it. And if chaos had brought them this far, then maybe, just maybe, it could save them now. His fingers flew across the controls. Elias, what the hell are you doing? Sienna's voice was raw with panic. Ending this. He was overriding the fleet's AI firewalls, feeding the same chaotic algorithm that had broken the Xor'Kai into their quantum core. If the virus had disrupted their collective consciousness, then it could do the same to their weapon systems. The bomb was built on order, on exact mathematical precision. Elias was about to turn it into randomized nonsense. Inside the harbinger of order, Vectal could feel the unraveling. His neural implants flickered with static as the virus invaded the ship's final systems, corrupting its last remnants of control. The bomb sequence stuttered, the calculations fractured, the once perfect annihilation equation began to deviate. The universe itself was fighting back. And then the harbinger of order imploded in a cascade of warped space-time, its own destruction folding in on itself in an impossible spiral. The quantum weapon detonated, but instead of an erasure event, it dispersed in an unpredictable collapse, creating a gravitational anomaly that spiraled harmlessly into deep space. Elias collapsed back against the console, breathless. The war was over for real this time. The Xor'Kai Empire was gone. The survivors, the few who had adapted, fled into deep space. Some vanished into the void, seeking exile. Others formed scattered warbands, no longer bound by a singular doctrine. For the first time in their history, they would be individuals, but humanity's victory was not without cost. Sienna stood in the wreckage of the command deck, watching the remains of the Xor'Kai fleet drift away. She had wanted to save humanity, but now, looking at the destruction, at the sheer magnitude of what they had done, she wasn't sure they had saved anything at all. They had weaponized chaos, and now humanity had to live with what that meant. Elias met her gaze. "We won." Her lips pressed into a thin line. "Did we?" Because the truth was, the Xor'Kai had been a civilization of order, and humanity had broken them with chaos. But what happened when the only way to win was to keep embracing that chaos? What happened when the next war came, and humanity had no choice but to be worse than their enemy? Elias didn't have an answer, but he could already feel the weight of the question. The war was over, but the future had never been more uncertain. The stars bore witness to the silence that followed the war. For the first time in weeks, there were no more emergency broadcasts, no more desperate retreat signals, no more panicked battle reports. The space around Saturn, once a killing ground of burning wreckage and fractured fleets, had become eerily still. The Xor'Kai Empire, the single greatest military force humanity had ever encountered, was gone. But victory did not feel like salvation. Elias Voss stood on the ruined command deck of Ironclad, staring at the tactical display, which no longer showed an advancing enemy. Only silence. It should have been a moment of triumph. Instead, it felt like a funeral. The reports came in slowly, fragmented and raw. The Xor'Kai had either fled into deep space or self-destructed, their civilization unraveling into isolated factions, disconnected from the hive that had once defined them. Some human ships were still trying to recover survivors from the wreckage, but others had begun something darker, hunting the scattered Xor'Kai remnants like wounded prey, finishing what the chaos had started. Elias watched these developments with a cold weight in his gut. He had expected humanity to celebrate, to breathe relief at their survival. Instead, they had tasted absolute victory, and now some wanted more. The human forces had fractured. The official military had been gutted, with command authority all but non-existent. In its place, independent fleets, rogue captains and warlords had begun staking their own claims over the wreckage of the Sol system. Some saw themselves as protectors, desperate to rebuild. Others saw themselves as something else, the inheritors of war. A transmission crackled through the remains of the battle network. "We should chase them down," a former admiral declared, his voice heavy with adrenaline. "Hunt the survivors. Ensure they never return." It was vengeance, not necessity. Sienna Kade's voice cut through the chaos of the bridge. "We weren't supposed to become this." Elias turned to her. She looked tired, hollow, the weight of what they had done pressing into her shoulders. She had been the one to devise the chaos virus, the algorithm that had turned the tide. She had thought at the time that it was their only option, that weaponizing disorder was a necessary evil. But now she saw the consequences. Humanity had not just survived the war, they had changed, and now there were no rules left. A final transmission was recovered from the wreckage of the Harbinger of Order. It was Vektel's last words before his death. A message not of rage nor vengeance, but warning. You have won this battle. You have survived, but you have not saved yourselves. The audio crackled. Chaos is not a weapon. It is a sickness, and it will consume you. Then, silence. Sienna let out a breath. He's not wrong. Elias stared at the wreckage outside the viewport, at the scattered fleets, the remnants of humanity now fractured and leaderless. For years they had fought under one belief, that the Xor'Kai were the great existential threat, that if they won this war, they would finally be free. But now there were no more enemies, only themselves. Elias knew he had a choice. He could let it happen, let the chaos continue, let the remnants of humanity fight over the ashes, let the war consume them from within, or he could stop it. He opened a fleet-wide transmission, his voice calm, even as the weight of his decision settled over him. "The war is over," he said. "We will not become the thing we fought against. We will not hunt down survivors. We will not burn what's left of the universe because we don't know how to stop fighting." The channel buzzed with arguments, dissent. Some captains refused to listen, eager for more war, eager for more destruction. Elias didn't care. He had spent his entire career defying expectations. He would do it again. And if the only way to stop chaos was to take control of it, then so be it. Some human fleets disappeared into the void, rejecting the idea of rebuilding, taking the lessons of war, and vanishing into the unknown. Others, under Elias's leadership, began the slow, painful work of reconstruction. Earth had survived, but at what cost? Sienna stayed by his side, though her eyes carried the weight of what they had done. Neither of them could be certain what came next, but one thing was clear. The universe had changed, and humanity was now something new. The stars stretched vast and empty before them. Elias Voss stood on the bridge of the ironclad, staring into the abyss of deep space. The war was over. The Xor'Kai were gone, scattered into oblivion, their empire shattered beyond repair. Humanity had won. And yet, as he looked at the remains of the battlefield, the drifting husks of alien warships, the smoldering wreckage of human vessels, the eerie silence left in the wake of total destruction, he could not shake the feeling that something fundamental had been lost. Not just the enemy, something deeper, something human. The fleets had gone their separate ways. Some, broken and war-torn, had returned to Earth and its remaining colonies, desperate to rebuild from the ruins. Others, the ones who had embraced chaos, who had learned to love the war too much, had left, disappearing into the void. No one knew where they were going, but the galaxy had felt their presence now, and humanity's reputation would never be the same. Transmission flickered across the deep space channels, encoded in an unfamiliar language. Sienna Kade stared at it for a long time, reading and rereading the translated text. It was from the Xor'Kai. Not all of them had perished. Not all of them had self-destructed. Some had adapted. Some had learned from humanity's chaos. And now they had a message. "We understand now. We will evolve. We will return." Sienna closed the transmission, her hands trembling. It wasn't over. Not really. Elias stood alone in the darkened bridge, watching the stars shift beyond the viewport. He had spent his whole life fighting, leading, surviving. Now there was no one left to fight. And yet, he had never felt more uncertain. Sienna's voice was quiet behind him. "What do we do now?" He exhaled, closing his eyes for a long moment, then slowly he turned back to her. "We prepare." The war was over, but the chaos had only just begun.